All right, guys, this is crazy. So the Trump administration just froze childcare funding to Minnesota, and now they're expanding it to all 50 states. We're talking about $185 million frozen in Minnesota alone, with potentially over $2 billion in Medicaid funding on the line by the end of this month if they don't meet federal demands. And this all started gaining massive attention after claims of widespread fraud in the state's childcare system. So let me break down what's happening because this situation is absolutely insane and it's escalating fast. So the Trump administration responded hard and fast. Let me show you this Fox News clip where they break down what's happening.
Department of Health and Human Services froze $185 million for childcare in Minnesota and created new verification requirements for businesses to be able to be reimbursed. Despite the claims of widespread fraud, though, that has allegedly been allowed to go on for years, Minnesota Democrats are criticizing the president for this temporary pause.
We're taking fraud seriously. We're working every day to improve our systems, hold those criminals accountable, and move our state forward. That's why it's
Okay, so the Department of Health and Human Services froze $185 million for childcare in Minnesota and created new verification requirements. Despite the claims of widespread fraud that's allegedly been going on for years, Minnesota Democrats are criticizing the president for this temporary pause. Interesting that they're calling it a temporary pause when the Trump administration is making it sound pretty permanent until they get what they want. And this happened on Tuesday, December 31st, when Deputy HHS Secretary Jim O'Neill announced on X that they're freezing all federal child care payments to Minnesota. Not just some of it, all of it. O'Neill said this is in response to blatant fraud that appears to be rampant in Minnesota and across the country. He demanded that Governor Tim Walz conduct a comprehensive audit of the daycare centers identified in the video, including attendance records, licenses, complaints, investigations, and inspections. But it doesn't stop at Minnesota. I'm looking at this NPR article that says the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is freezing federal funding meant to help low-income families pay for child care nationwide. And they specifically mention this came just days after the Trump administration singled out Minnesota following that conservative influencer's video. Starting immediately, all payments from HHS's Administration for Children and Families, that's all 50 states, will now require justification, a receipt, or photo evidence before money gets sent. That's a massive change affecting child care funding across the entire country. I found this tweet saying Fox News reported that the Trump administration has now frozen more than $190 million in funding for Minnesota, but that's just a drop in the bucket compared to what could be coming. There's more than $2 billion in Medicaid funding on the line if the state doesn't meet HHS demands for documents and reforms by the end of this month. Here's another Fox clip on this.
The Trump administration has now frozen more than $190 million in funding for Minnesota, but that's just a drop in the bucket of what could be coming at the end of this month, with more than $2 billion in Medicaid funding on the line if the state doesn't meet HHS's demands for documents and reforms. Rich? Garrett?
Okay, so they're confirming more than $190 million frozen, but over $2 billion in Medicaid funding is at risk by the end of January if Minnesota doesn't comply with HHS demands. That's absolutely massive. We're not just talking about daycare funding anymore. We're talking about the entire Medicaid system for Minnesota potentially being cut off. Think about that for a second. If Minnesota doesn't provide the documentation and reforms the federal government is demanding, they could lose billions in healthcare funding for their most vulnerable residents. That's not just pressure, that's a nuclear option. Now here's the thing. Minnesota actually does have a serious fraud problem. This isn't just made up. Federal prosecutors have been investigating fraud in Minnesota for years, way before any of this recent attention. There's this ongoing case involving a nonprofit called Feeding Our Future, where prosecutors say $250 million in federal COVID-19 relief funds intended to feed children were misappropriated. They've called it the largest COVID-19 fraud scheme in the country. As of November, 77 people had been charged and over 90 people total have been charged since 2022. But it gets even bigger. A senior federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson, said at a press conference earlier this month that he believes at least half, maybe more, of the roughly $18 billion in federal funds that supported 14 Minnesota programs since 2018 may have been stolen. He said, "The magnitude of fraud in Minnesota cannot be overstated. It's staggering amounts of money that's been lost." So the Trump administration isn't making this up out of nowhere. There is documented, prosecuted, massive fraud in Minnesota. We're talking about billions of dollars that have disappeared from programs designed to help vulnerable populations, feeding children, providing health care, supporting families. The state's own auditor has been raising red flags for years. Minnesota's legislative auditor issued multiple reports showing weaknesses in oversight and fraud prevention across state agencies. The Department of Human Services, which oversees many of these programs, has been specifically cited for inadequate controls and monitoring. And it's not just small-time operations. Some of these fraud schemes involve sophisticated networks of fake businesses, shell companies, and money laundering operations. The Feeding Our Future case alone involved hundreds of millions being funneled through fake meal sites that claim to feed thousands of children who never existed. Looking at this New York Post article, Trump is predicting California will surpass Minnesota for fraud. The review started in Minnesota but will be expanded nationwide until feds can determine no taxpayer dollars are being spent fraudulently. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said on Fox and Friends that the administration is considering similar fraud investigations in other blue states like California and New York. So this isn't just about Minnesota. They're using this as a blueprint to go after Democratic-controlled states. Now, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who was the Democratic VP nominee, has pushed back hard. He said on social media, "This is Trump's long game. We've spent years cracking down on fraudsters. It's a serious issue. But this has been his plan all along. He's politicizing the issue to defund programs that help Minnesotans. And honestly, when you look at the timing and the scope, it's hard not to see the political angle here. The administration is threatening to withhold SNAP food aid funding from Democratic states unless they provide information about people receiving assistance. They're investigating unemployment insurance programs. They're talking about denaturalizing citizens. But at the same time, there is real fraud happening. That's not disputed. The question is whether the response is proportional and whether innocent families are going to suffer because of it. Now, here's what's really concerning about all this: the real impact on actual families and legitimate childcare providers who did nothing wrong. Minnesota has around 150,000 children receiving childcare assistance. These are low-income working families who depend on this funding to be able to go to their jobs. Without childcare assistance, many of these parents literally cannot afford to work. We're talking about single mothers working minimum wage jobs, families living paycheck to paycheck. And legitimate childcare providers? They're stuck in the middle of this. Many of them operate on thin margins already. Childcare is expensive to provide, but parents can't afford high prices, so government assistance fills that gap. When funding gets frozen, these providers don't get paid for services they've already provided. I've seen reports of daycare centers saying they might have to close because they can't make payroll without the reimbursements they're owed. These are businesses that have been operating legally, following all the rules, getting inspected regularly, and now they're being lumped in with fraudsters. One daycare owner in Minneapolis said she's owed over $30,000 in back payments and doesn't know how she's going to pay her staff next month. She's been running her center for 15 years with no violations, but now she's caught up in this federal crackdown. And think about the timing. This is happening right after the holidays, when families are already stretched financially. Parents are being told their child care assistance might be cut off with basically no notice. That's not just an inconvenience. That's potentially life-altering for families already struggling to make ends meet. The Minnesota Department of Human Services said they're working with HHS to provide the requested documentation, but they also warned that if this funding freeze continues, it could force thousands of children out of care and potentially close hundreds of licensed child care facilities across the state. All right, so here's where we're at. The Trump administration has frozen child care funding to Minnesota and is now requiring all 50 states to provide additional verification before they get federal child care dollars. Minnesota has over $2 billion in Medicaid funding on the line by the end of this month. Minnesota definitely has a documented fraud problem. Billions have been stolen from federal programs over the past several years, and nearly 100 people have been charged in various schemes. The Feeding Our Future case alone involved $250 million in stolen COVID relief funds. Federal prosecutors believe potentially half of the $18 billion in federal funding to Minnesota programs since 2018 may have been fraudulent. But the response has become massively political, with Trump threatening similar investigations in California and other blue states, and Democrats saying this is just an excuse to defund programs that help low-income families. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said they're looking at blue states specifically for fraud investigations. The real victims here? The 150,000 children and families in Minnesota who rely on childcare assistance and now have no idea if their funding is going to continue. And the legitimate daycare providers who are owed money for services they've already provided but can't get paid because of the freeze. This story is still developing, and I guarantee we're going to see more states get caught up in this. California is already being mentioned as the next target. The question is whether this leads to real accountability for fraud and better oversight, or if it just becomes another weapon in the political battle between red and blue states while innocent families suffer. One thing's for sure, when you've got federal prosecutors saying half of $18 billion may have been stolen, something has been seriously broken in Minnesota's oversight systems for years. Whether this federal intervention fixes that or makes things worse for the people who need help the most, we'll have to wait and see. Let me know what you think in the comments. Is this justified based on the documented fraud, or is it government overreach that's going to hurt innocent families more than it helps? Drop your thoughts below.